I invite you to take your copy of God's Word this morning and open it to Exodus chapter 5. Also have notes that are in the bulletin made for you to be able to follow along. I've entitled this sermon this morning, "The Strong Hand of the Lord Alone Saves." Now, back in college, my senior year of college was 20 years ago this year, and one of my roommates, Aaron Henley, began dating a wonderful girl named Bethany. Bethany would eventually become his wife, and Bethany had the fortunate joy of getting to spend a lot of time in our dorm room with four guys who were sports-loving dudes. So we watched a ton of football and baseball and basketball, and Bethany didn't care about any of it. She just had googly eyes for her man, Aaron, so she would sit there on the couch while we were watching basketball games. But we decided that we would incorporate her by teaching her something special. We would teach her a phrase to say that in the middle of the game, while she's not been paying too much attention, we would lean over to her, point at her, and right when she knew that we pointed at her, she would yell out this phrase. It was during basketball games. When somebody would dunk on someone else, we would point at her and she would yell out, "Posterized! You got posterized!" What that means is whenever somebody dunks on somebody, they would take the picture of that dunk and they would blow it up and put it on a poster to be able to hang it up on the wall so that the event of that one dunk would reverberate and would be remembered over and over and over. One of the all-time great NBA dunkers was a guy by the name of Vince Carter. He was absolutely incredible. In warm-ups with an open rim, he would just sky in the air. He was amazing to watch, but no one actually watches clip after clip of him in warm-ups. The thing that people get on YouTube to watch his highlights is when he's dunking in the game on people. And indeed, Vince Carter is known for having the single greatest all-time dunk in basketball history. And it happened in the Olympics. I got a picture of that for you. In the Olympics, Vince Carter jumped over a 7'3" tall Frenchman to make a dunk. It was unbelievable and unexpected. The guys on the floor couldn't believe it. Kevin Garnett's reaction is as great as the whole video clip, as he's going nuts. But what's so great about this dunk is the epitome of getting posterized. The next one there, they turned that dunk. I've had that poster before in my room, remembering this moment where Vince Carter posterized the guy. It happened on a fluke. The play happened where it was after an inbound. Vince Carter stole the ball, and it's almost like he lined up the 7'3" tall guy right in front of him so that he could jump over him and dunk the ball. Now, why am I teaching you about the concept of posterizing someone? Why am I looking at you ladies and I'm pointing at you and you can go, posterized? Why? Because in the book of Exodus, God lines up Pharaoh directly under the basket and absolutely posterizes him. Vince Carter's dunk was known as the dunk of death. That's what they called it. That was the moniker of this greatest dunk of all time. Well, indeed in Exodus, what we're going to see is God lines up the dunk of death against Pharaoh. And he does it for the sake of his glory being magnified all over the world and all across history. Indeed, thousands of years later, we're going to talk about the day in which God posterized Pharaoh. That's what this chapter is about. This chapter is actually about God lining Pharaoh up underneath the basket, setting him exactly where he wants him, so that when he dunks on him, it isn't just something that you could ignore. It becomes something that reverberates through history. This is what the chapter's about. There's a back and forth reality in the 10 plagues and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And what all of this means in Exodus is it's producing the moment in which God declares emphatically, I am who I am. And what he means by that is I will get glory over my enemies when I judge them. And I will get glory when I save my people. And I'm going to do it in a spectacular way. I'm going to do it in a way that you could only say it was only the strong hand of the Lord that saved my people. There was no other example. There was no other way to express that's how the people of God were able to be led out. And we see that here in this chapter. God says, I posterize my enemies. That's the God you're dealing with. I dunk all over them. I set them up, and then I do something for my glory. And if you don't see that in Exodus, you're just going to miss what's going on in this chapter. You're going to struggle. You're going to struggle over the persecution and difficulties of God's people. And you're going to come to the question that Moses asked in this text. Why? Why, God, are you doing this? You've got to see God's answer. God's answer is, I posterize my enemies. In this very chapter, we're going to see Pharaoh is positioned exactly where God wants him to be, so that when he rains down his judgment against him by performing the dunk of death, and when he miraculously rescues his people out of slavery to Egypt by his strong arm, the glory of God will be made jaw-droppingly, awe-inspiringly incredible. And people will do nothing other than praise him. Here's the big idea this morning. The big idea is that Pharaoh's refusal to let the Israelites go to worship and his imposing heavier labor upon them sets the stage for the salvation of the Israelites to be by the strong hand of the Lord alone. Look with me here in our text. We're going to see 6 meetings in our text. So you're following along in the notes. There's 6 points. It's the 6 meetings that chapter 5 moves through. So verse 1 through 5, the first meeting, Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh, a request to go worship in the wilderness. Would you read with me the first 5 verses? Later, Moses and Aaron went in and said to Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival for me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh responded, "Who is this Lord, that I should obey him by letting Israel go? I don't know the Lord. And besides, I will not let Israel go." They answered, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please, let us go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness, so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, or else he may strike us with plague or sword." The king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why are you causing the people to neglect their work? Get to your labor." Pharaoh also said, "Look, the people of the land are so numerous, and you would stop them from their labor?" Here you need to remember that we ended last chapter with Moses and Aaron before the people, and the people were responding by getting on their knees and worshiping God. They're believing Moses and Aaron are the chosen mouthpiece of God. They are going to be the people that lead Israel out of slavery. And so this chapter begins with Moses and Aaron. The text says later, goes straight to Pharaoh, and they have an audience with Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron go in before him, and they say these words, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says." Now, this phrase itself is important. It's the first time in the Bible where we get this messenger phrase, this phrase that what's coming next is not just coming from me. It's not just coming from my head. What's coming next is coming from the Lord. You're going to hear this phrase repeated all through the prophets, over and over. In fact, the prophets learned it from Moses here. And they're going to say, what we are about to say, I'm relaying this to you only as a messenger. These are the words of God. Yahweh says these things. And then they say to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." But interestingly, the request to be let go doesn't seem to be an absolute request. Doesn't seem to say, "Let my people go and leave Egypt permanently." It says, "Let my people go so that so that we may hold a festival for the Lord in the wilderness. Verse 3, let us go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. So the request is just let us go for 3 days. Now first we should note that this shouldn't be odd in the Egyptian culture. The Egyptian culture had a plethora of gods that they worshiped. At some point in the 1200 BC, we have a list of their calendar. They have 47 holy days on their calendar for festival days for the worship of all of their different gods. They understood what it was to have festivals to this god, and this god. And you should note, the Egyptians didn't worship all the gods equally. They would have some devoted to the sun god, some devoted to the frog god, some devoted to the moon god. There was just different groups that were divided. And so a group within Egypt wanting to have a festival, that's not that odd. But you should note, why is it that it's asked for a 3-day journey? I think what's going on here is it shows Pharaoh's unreasonableness just to even an idea of letting them go for 3 days. Pharaoh isn't just, the first interaction with Pharaoh's not just unreasonable of the idea to let Israel leave. Pharaoh is implacable on the idea to even give them 3 days to go sacrifice to their gods. You need to see this in the text. Look how Pharaoh responds. Pharaoh goes from 0 to 100 immediately. There is a fury within his response. Pharaoh responded in verse 2, who is the Lord that I should obey him? Who is Yahweh? Who are you talking about? I do not bow down and obey the commands of Yahweh. I don't know him. Besides, even if I did, I'm not letting him go. And then he moves on in verse 4, and he looks at Moses and Aaron and he says, why are you causing the people to neglect their work? Seemingly, at the request that Moses and Aaron have gone in, I think the picture here is like the people are outside waiting to hear the response of Moses and Aaron. They've stopped working and they're anticipating that, remember, end of chapter 4, God said Moses and Aaron are going to go in, they're going to let everyone go. They bow down, they worship, they're ready. They know Moses and Aaron are going to go make the request, and they're just ready to pack their bags and go. So they're no longer putting out the work. It's like the guy who knows he's getting fired in a week, and he's like, you know what, I'm not going to be putting in my 80 hours this week. I'm going to slow down my pace. So they're slowing down, and Pharaoh looks at them and says, Moses and Aaron, you need to get them to their labor in verse 4. In fact, he looks and he says the same thing that previous pharaohs have said. The people are so numerous in the land, they are too valuable to me. They must labor, they must work. And so here we have this Pharaoh who is unreasonable from the beginning. There's no way of reasoning with this Pharaoh, and you need to see that at the beginning of chapter 5. Remember, God told Moses, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. But what do we see from the very beginning? We see a Pharaoh who does not recognize Yahweh. He doesn't obey Yahweh. In fact, what this is going to set up in the next few chapters is this story is not just a story between Moses and Pharaoh. It's not just a story, even in this chapter, between the Egyptian slave masters and the Hebrew foremen and these fights. It's a story between Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt and the true God of the world, Yahweh. It's a battle of the gods that we see here. And Pharaoh's heart from the beginning is set against Yahweh. But next we see here, as a result of Pharaoh being set against Yahweh and set against Moses, we see the second meeting. Verse 6 through 9, Pharaoh goes from meeting with Moses and Aaron to meeting with the Egyptian overseers, and he commands them by imposing heavier labor on the Israelites. Read with me verses 6 through 9. That day, Pharaoh commanded the overseers of the people as well as their foremen, don't continue to supply the people with straw for making bricks, as before. They must go and gather straw for themselves, but require the same quota of bricks from them as they were making before. Do not reduce it, for they are slackers. That is why they are crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Impose heavier work on the men. Then they will be occupied with it and not pay attention to deceptive words." So the text here has Pharaoh bringing in the Egyptian slave masters before them. He's going to speak to them, but also note there's these foremen in the text. These are Israelites. And so there is a two-tiered system of middle workers here. Imagine the owner of the company has the general manager and the assistant manager in the meeting, and they're going to talk about all the employees. And so he's going to speak to the general manager, the Egyptian overseers, the slave masters, and the assistant to the general managers, right? The lower ones, these assistant managers, are Hebrews. They're Israelite foremen, and they're in charge. They're kind of the head of the slave gang. And so he's going to bring them in. And Pharaoh, that very day, says, you know what? We're going to cut out all of the straw. No longer provide them straw. The straw was integral to the brick-making process in this era of Egypt. This is not kiln-made bricks. It's not fired bricks. It's sun-dried bricks. And so they would take the form, they would use the mud and the clay, they would put it in the form, but they would put straw within that to act as a binder to keep from the shrinkage or breakage of the brick. And so it was an absolutely vital part. In fact, the word for these bricks that are made, the Egyptian word for it is the root word by which we get the word adobe all the way down into our culture today. These are adobe-made bricks, sun-dried bricks that they're going to build their buildings with. And they say, you know what, we're cutting off all of the straw production for them. Don't give them any straw, but don't cut their quota. They're going to need to work harder. In fact, Pharaoh's idea here is the very reason why they're asking to go have some time to go sacrifice and to go worship, is it must just mean that they're lazy and they don't have enough work to do. It's kind of like that kid who kind of mouths off to the teacher who says, "I've already done all my homework. I can goof off in class," right? And the teacher says, "Oh, really? I got more work for you to do," right? I'm going to keep you busy so that you don't get in trouble. So Pharaoh is thinking, you know what? They're not busy enough. We're going to make them busier so that they don't have any time to think. Now look at the words there at verse 9. So they won't pay attention to deceptive words. Pharaoh is placing upon them this kind of overarching way to interpret what Moses and Aaron has done. They're trying to say, you know what, Moses and Aaron, you've had this task, but people don't listen to Moses and Aaron. What they're doing is deceiving you. What we're seeing here is Pharaoh is putting on the first political spin onto what is happening. And so there's this political spin. Oh, that Moses and Aaron trying to do that? That's deceiving words. Don't listen to them here. And so they're moving along here. Pharaoh wants to break the people's spirit. The faith the people were putting into Moses and Aaron revealed that there was a hope that God was doing something new, and Pharaoh has every intention to utterly shatter that hope. And so we see next in verses 10 through 14 a third meeting that happens. After the meeting of Pharaoh with the overseers, now the Egyptian overseers and the Israelite foremen go and meet with the people. More difficult labor and beatings happen for failure to produce. Read with me verses 10 through 14 in our text. So the overseers and foremen of the people went out and said to them, "This is what Pharaoh says, I am not giving you straw. Go get straw yourselves wherever you can find it. But there will be no reduction at all in your workload." So the people scattered throughout the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw, and the overseers insisted, "Finish your assigned work each day, just as you did when straw was provided." Then the Israelite foremen, whom Pharaoh's slave drivers had set over the people, were beaten and asked, "Why haven't you finished making your prescribed number of bricks yesterday or today as you did before?" Here in this text, we see this reality that the middlemen, the general manager, taking instructions from Pharaoh, start exerting that power over those who are the assistant managers. They are not going to be the ones that the owner gets mad at, so they're going to unleash their fury upon the next one down the chain. They bring the people out and they instruct that we're no longer going to provide straw, and the people are going to have to go find a substitute for themselves. What seems to be implied here is the straw was grown in Egypt, and basically saying you no longer have any access to the fields where the straw was grown. You need to go search all over and find it yourself. And where they go, it's not like saying, hey, we previously used this straw, but now you have to do the cutting, and here's the straw. The people don't have access to the straw at all. So the text specifically says they go search the land for stubble. They go search the land. Seemingly here, the stubble is actually the after the stalk has been cut down for the straw, what's left in the ground. Like you're going to have to dig up the remaining little parts of the ground, and you're going to have to bring that up to be able to use for this. Of course, it's not going to be as effective for the bricks. They're not going to have plentiful amounts, and expectedly, they're not able to make their quota. The people are not able to get it all done. And so here, they face the slave drivers beginning to beat them. And you hear this in that verse, in verse 13 and 14. It just seems like the slave drivers are laughing at mocking them. There is a cruelness. Why haven't you finished making your prescribed number of bricks yesterday or today as you did before? And Israelites are looking at there going, no duh. Obviously, we're not able to do this. It's impossible. There's no way we're going to be able to accomplish this task. Why are you beating us? And we should sit here and just realize, okay, last chapter, Israel heard a word from the Lord. I've sent Moses to set you free. A chapter later, they're getting beaten. Bad things are happening. They're in a terrible position. It's only gotten worse for them. Not only do they have a slave driver over them, forcing them to work, the slave driver is now beating them because they're in an impossible situation. And so we find the next meeting, the next section in our text, the fourth meeting, is the Israelite foremen go straight to Pharaoh. And they ask Pharaoh for a reduction, and they get no reduction in the workload. Verse 15 through 19 says this. So the Israelite foreman went in and cried for help to Pharaoh. Why are you treating your servants this way? No straw has been given to your servants, yet they say to us, make bricks. Look, your servants are being beaten, but it is your own people who are at fault. But he said, you are slackers, slackers. That is why you're saying, let us go sacrifice to the Lord. Now get to work. No straw will be given to you, but you must produce the same quantity of bricks. The Israelite foremen saw that they were in trouble when they were told, you cannot reduce your daily quota of bricks. So the foreman, going directly to Pharaoh, crying out to him, why are you treating us like this? We're your servants, Pharaoh. We're happy to serve you. We're working for you. We're trying to make bricks for you, to build buildings for you, to make a name for you. The Hebrew here is really choppy. It's almost like they're exhausted. It's almost like they're at wit's end. Why are you beating us? We can't make bricks. You don't give us straw. But Pharaoh is implacable. Pharaoh cries out, slackers, slackers. All I see is slackers in front of me. Slackers you are. And then, note here, Pharaoh gets to the root problem. The root problem, Pharaoh says, is you want to go sacrifice to the Lord. Your religion is your root problem. I have a problem with your beliefs. You believe in a God, and you're not bowing down to me. Indeed, you say you're my servants, but if you were my servants, you would be serving me alone. So the root issue that they're facing is an issue of their religion. And the foremen realize that they're in an impossible situation. The end result of this is they're only going to get beaten and abused worse. And so we have a fifth meeting in the text. They move from meeting with Pharaoh to immediately meeting with Moses and Aaron. The Israelite foremen confront Moses and Aaron, and a curse goes against them. Look here in the text, verse 20 and 21. When they left Pharaoh, they confronted Moses and Aaron, who stood waiting to meet them. May the Lord take note of you and judge, they said to them, because you have made us reek to Pharaoh and his officials, putting a sword in their hands to kill us. The fifth meeting here of the text has the foreman immediately going to Moses and Aaron. The picture is like Moses and Aaron are standing outside the door after the foremen have gone in to meet with Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron are right there. And no longer are Israelites bending their knee in worship before the Lord. Now they're balling up their fist against Moses and Aaron. They want to fight. The first words here of the text, they invoke a curse upon Moses and Aaron. In the name of the Lord, they call upon the Lord to judge them. They call upon the Lord to bring down judgment upon the head of Moses and Aaron. It's interesting here. It seems to be the case that they're implying the problem is not the message, the problem is the messengers. Moses and Aaron, you screwed up, and whatever you said to Pharaoh, you messed up for us. We heard God. We heard the Lord tell us we're getting out. See how they're calling upon the Lord to bring down a curse upon them? There's still seemingly some amount of belief in the Lord, right? Lord, curse you means they're believing in the Lord. But they're looking at them and saying, the problem is with you. You have made us reek. You must be false prophets. That's what they're insinuating here. The Lord hasn't spoken to you. If he had, we wouldn't be in this situation. We wouldn't reek to Pharaoh. You put a sword in his hands. You've set the ball on the tee. It's because of you that we are in this position. And that finally gets us to the last meeting of the text. After saying this, after the foremen come and point their finger in the chest of Moses, point their finger in Aaron and say, you are the problem, we're going to see some very real life activity here. I want you to see in verses 22 and 23, Moses comes before the Lord and he brings a complaint to the Lord. A complaint of why. And then we're going to see the clear response from the Lord about his strong arm. As we read these verses, I'm reminded of the call to worship that we opened our text with this morning. Let me just read those verses again for you from Psalm 88. They reverberate here. Lord God of my salvation, I cry out before you day and night. May my prayer reach your presence. Listen to my cry. I call to you for help, Lord. In the morning my prayer meets you. Lord, why do you reject me? Why do you hide your face from me? And so here, verse 22, Moses went back to the Lord. And he asked, Lord, why have you caused trouble for this people? Why did you ever send me? Ever since I went into Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has caused trouble for this people. And you haven't rescued your people at all. But the Lord replied to Moses, Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of a strong hand, he will let them go. And because of a strong hand, he will drive them from this land. Moses responds to the cursing that he has received from the people. It's evident that he himself is shaken by the events that have happened, the events that have occurred in his world has caused him to return to the Lord and cry out to the Lord, why? This isn't what I expected to be. In fact, he asks two questions, and then he gets really bold, and he has one declaration. He removes the why in front. The first two questions, why have you caused trouble? Why did you send me? That's the first two. But then the third, he doesn't even ask why anymore. He just says this, you haven't rescued your people. That's a really bold statement, a declaration to God. Moses here implies that the charges that have been laid at his feet seem to be just. God, why aren't you saving us? If you really were God, you wouldn't put me through this circumstance. You wouldn't let us endure persecution. You wouldn't make my life worse. You wouldn't make this situation more difficult. The psalmist cries out those very same words. Psalm 88 is placed in the Psalms, in the book of the Psalms at the very end of the book 3. Psalm 88, 89, 90 lead up into this reality, and 88 and 89 is the time right before the exile. Those crying out of, why have you rejected us, is the period of Israel right before they're going to get taken into Babylon and taken away. Jerusalem is about to fall. The temple is about to get burned down. There's almost no experience of God fulfilling his promises that he made, and so the psalmist just cries out in agony. In fact, this is one of the very few psalms that there's no positive resolution at the end of the psalm. We sang earlier from Psalm 42, right? Psalm 42 is powerful because of how it begins. Why are you downcast, O my soul, right? There's these powerful emotions of depression. The psalmist knew what it was to be depressed and to experience that. But Psalm 42 takes us from depression and it brings us to the resolution, right? For I will yet praise you again. I'm going to put my hope in you. The psalmist in Psalm 42 says, put your hope in the Lord, for I will yet praise you. Psalm 88 doesn't do that. Psalm 88 ends with these words. Listen, verse 17 and 18. All day long they surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me. You have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend. The cry of darkness all around me is that same cry that Moses is making in this text. God, if you were God, you wouldn't allow these things to enter into my life. Why aren't you doing what you said you were going to do to save the people? Why have you made my circumstances more difficult? God, if you really loved me, you would keep me from these circumstances. I wouldn't endure being made to reek in front of some pagan authority. I wouldn't endure this sickness, this diagnosis that came into my life. God, if you loved me, I wouldn't have that. Why is this happening? God, if you loved me, I wouldn't still be depressed every morning. I wouldn't wake up on my bed just downcast in my soul. I've been praying over and over and over that this would lift, and it hasn't lifted. Darkness is my closest friend. Here in Exodus 6:1, the Lord brings a kind, gracious response to Moses. He doesn't backhand Moses. Moses just said the boldest word Moses could do. Moses brought before God his question of why. And God allowed him to ask why. God allows the psalmist in Psalm 88 to ask why and to express his darkness. God allows David, the psalmist in Psalm 42, why are you downcast, O my soul? You got to see here. Moses is going to the right person in his agony. Moses is still believing and acting in faith by coming to the Lord with these questions. Moses isn't running away from God. He's coming to God with his life. Moses is bearing his burdens to the Lord. And in that case, Moses is exactly where the Lord wants him to be. And you got to see the Lord's answer in verse 1 of chapter 6. We're going to expand this for the rest of 6. This is what next week is going to be all about. But you got to see how the Lord graciously responds. It's the response that I think you and I need to hear this morning in the midst of our own desperation. God responds, I'm positioning Pharaoh exactly where I want him so that I can dunk all over him, so that I can posterize him, so that I can destroy him. And when I do, I'm going to get glory over it. No one's going to be able to say the reason why Israel got out of Egypt was the benevolence of Pharaoh. No one's going to be able to say Pharaoh was the cause of them leaving. Pharaoh provided for them. Pharaoh agreed to their request. Pharaoh gave them their needs. Pharaoh did this. No, no, no. I'm hardening up Pharaoh by positioning him exactly where I want him, so that when I do my mighty deed by my strong arm and I dunk all over him, the only answer that you will have is God's glory will be on full display, and it will reverberate all throughout the land. Indeed, at the end of the Exodus, after God dunks all over the Egyptians, the fear of the Lord spreads all throughout Canaan, all throughout Edom, all throughout Midian. Everywhere they go, they have heard about this God. And indeed, it didn't just stay there in that century. The Exodus reverberates through the pages of Scripture. When God says, I am who I am, he's not just describing that he is the eternally existent God. What he's describing is, this is how I operate. I am a posterizing God. I set up my enemies, and I conquer them. And I conquer them in such a way that no one can say there was any other way for them to be saved. It was utterly impossible but for my strong arm to show up. Look at verse 1 again. Look at how he says it. Look at verse 1. But the Lord replied to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of a strong hand he will let them go. Because of a strong hand he will drive them from this land. It will not be because of Pharaoh's benevolence. It will be because of my mighty arm that I save my people. My friends, I think we all need to consider these 3 verses deeply in our own personal lives. Have you cried out to the Lord in the context of faith and brought your questions as to why to him? It's absolutely entirely appropriate. Looking around in the room, looking at cancer survivors, looking at people who have unheard of diagnosis that almost no one else they know is going through, looking at people who have experienced loss of their spouses, looking at people who have walking through difficult roads with their spouses right now. Looking at people who have lost children in the room. Have you come before the Lord with faith like Moses, with faith like the psalmist, and just said, God, why? Why is this happening? Why have you endured this? Why are you allowing me to go through this? And then, have you heard God's response to you? The questions are not a shock to the Lord. The Lord just hasn't revealed yet his will for your life in that circumstance. The Lord is not surprised that you are going through that circumstance. The Lord has promised he has a good purpose for it. He just hasn't let you know yet what that purpose is that he's working all things together for. He's not working evil in your life. He's working all things together for the good of those who love him and who are called according to his purposes. He knows you're in the dark, and he receives your cries of faith in the midst of your burdens. Indeed, he wants you to cast all of your burdens on him. He wants you to get to the point where you're not trying to carry the burdens on yourself, on your own back. And then by his mighty hand, He desires to place His glory on full display in your life. A friend of mine shared just yesterday that doctors have informed him of some really difficult news because of a terrible car accident that happened a few months ago that crushed his legs, shattered his ankles, broke his tibia. He was told just yesterday that they're going to have to amputate his right leg. A few months ago, he was in a church service just like you and I. Now, he's facing having his leg amputated. Oh Lord, why? Why have you allowed this into my life? Why didn't you save me from that accident? Why didn't you heal me? Why didn't you let the surgeries be successful? Why have all the surgeries and the pain I've already gone through result in no success, and they're now telling me I have to have my leg amputated? I want you to hear his testimony in these words. Here's his testimony. I am convinced that all that has happened on this journey the past 6 months are under the perfect loving providence of God. I'm praying that God will use my story and life as an amputee for His great purposes. I'm sure that I will meet people and have opportunities for the gospel I otherwise would never have if all of this had not happened. I'm looking forward to the days ahead and working hard to learn how to successfully navigate life and ministry with a prosthetic leg. I hope no one will feel sorry for me or pity me, but rather see all of this as part of God's great plan to use my life for His kingdom. How grateful I and my family are for so many of you who care for us and are praying. Now, let's do this. And Lord, do something great for your glory. That's a man who looks at his circumstances and he's heard an answer back to his question, why? He doesn't necessarily know all the plan, but what he knows is this. He knows God is a posterizing God and He's operating for His glory, and he wants to be a part of it. And he starts imagining, maybe this means I'm going to start meeting people that I would never go in front of. I'm going to meet people in the amputee community that I would never see before, and those people need the gospel. Let me be a part of that. What this is expressing is that Psalm 42, I will praise you and praise you again. I'm going to put my hope in the Lord. I'm going to transform this circumstance because I see that God says, I am who I am. I'm the God who gets glory by saving my people. And I save my people against the backdrop of dunking on my enemy, of judging them, of stopping that. So sometimes my people have to get set up into situations where they're underneath the heavy hand of the enemy so that I can bring about a mighty salvation by the strong hand of the Lord alone. Would you pray with me?